Welcome to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Path Forward series. If you've been joining us regularly, welcome back. If you're just discovering the series, we're delighted that you're here, and we hope you find these discussions valuable and insightful. We've been bringing together leaders from academia, government, business, all types of crucial fields as we examine the next phase of the pandemic, returning to work. We've explored various aspects of what's next, everything from childcare and transportation to consumer confidence, sanitization, and almost everything in between. Today, we're talking about the economic recovery in this really challenging environment. Our country is marred in crisis, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social crisis. As the country begins to reopen, these issues are front of mind. How do we get to the other side of all of these crises? To the other side of a post-COVID world? What can each of us do to ensure when we get there that the world is better? And how long will it take us to get to that point? Today's Path Forward episode will feature someone who has interviewed dozens of experts on issues himself, and someone who will continue to be a thought leader on the role of business in our society, a question that the ongoing pandemic and social unrest has heightened. Last night, I had the opportunity to interview David Rubenstein in front of a smaller audience, but the conversation was so important to the path forward for this country that we wanted to share it with you. David Rubenstein is the founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the biggest and most successful private equity firms in the world. He also serves in various leadership capacities at different businesses and philanthropies, too many to name and be able to get to our program today. In my personal experience, I've learned so much from his interviews and his insights, and recently listened to him give a talk in his role as president of the Economic Club of Washington that was so insightful, we wanted to ask him to share it with a larger audience. He's one of the best interviewers in Washington, so it was a little intimidating to interview him myself. But I'd like to share it with you now.
Well, thank you very much. And I would just like to say that I appreciate the chance to speak at the Chamber. My firm has had a long-standing relationship with the Chamber. We've worked with Tom for many years. Now we're working with you, Suzanne. And it's been a great relationship. We've worked with Myron as well. And I enjoyed the work that you've done on our behalf and the behalf of so many other businesses. I also want to let everybody know that if you ever interview Suzanne, you're going to get a return interview request. So I interviewed Suzanne at the other day for the Economic Club of Washington, and now the price is she's going to interview me. So I'm used to being the interviewer, not the interviewee. So don't expect too much. At the beginning, I just want to make 5 minutes of opening comments to give you my biases that you'll probably will hear in the interview. So to tell you everything I know in 5 minutes, here it is. My view is that the economy is not going to come back as quickly as people would like. I think normally when you have a recession, the economy doesn't come back to where it was before the recession for about 3 years. And this is a deeper recession than we've had recently. It's probably deeper than the Great Recession when you've got essentially 25% of the workforce out of work. I also believe that we're going to get more legislation to deal with this. I think there'll be at least one more bill, probably in July, would be my guess, where you'll have about maybe $1.5 trillion to deal with some of the issues that haven't yet been addressed, or where some of the programs are working well and they need additional money. And I do think that you'll have a number of issues that haven't been addressed before, including liability-related issues that will be addressed by the Congress before they go home for July. That's my view. On the markets, I think the markets are ahead of where the economy is. I have just talked to so many people who are in the markets as I am, and we just don't quite understand why the markets are so ebullient, though we're happy to see it. I do think that there is a focus on the vaccine, and the vaccine progress makes the markets move forward. And remember, the market indexes now are heavily tech-oriented, and the tech companies have done quite well in this situation. But again, I think the markets are quite ahead of where they are, where they should be. Maybe in part that's because the Fed is doing such a good job, I think, of keeping the markets in liquid. The IPO market is working pretty well, and the debt market's working pretty well. But still, I think the markets are probably a little bit ahead of where the economy is. But again, I hope I'm wrong. On the pandemic, Clearly, the United States was not prepared for it. We still don't have testing. I still can't even get testing for myself. And I would say I've been struck by it in my own family. My daughter, my son-in-law, my two grandchildren who are 6 months old and 2 years old have come down with COVID-19. And obviously I think they'll be okay, but it's obviously something that has focused my attention on this pandemic. I do think that the supply chain clearly was broken, and we'll have to fix that either legislatively or the business community will have to fix the supply chain so we're not so dependent on another country for certain things that are essential. I think that will happen. On the reopening, I think the reopening is very complicated because many people, employees that we know or employees that we've surveyed, do not want to rush back until there is a vaccine. And it turns out that many employees actually like working at home. And some people that work at home, they have young children. If they don't have educational opportunities for these kids because no preschool or schools aren't opening, they really can't come back to work. And many are afraid of taking mass transit. So I think you're going to see a slow reopening. And I don't really see a reopening of offices for quite some time. I also think that many offices will probably never fully use all the office space they currently have, because I do think that many employers have recognized they can probably get by with fewer employees for a while because the economy is not coming back. And I think some employees are just not going to go back to the physical offices. In fact, some technology companies, as you all probably know, are working towards maybe not having any of their employees having to go back to work, and they can work remotely forever. I do think the U.S.-China relationship is in a very bad shape right now, and I don't expect it will improve until after the presidential election. There are no votes in the United States for saying how great China is for the Democrats or the Republicans. And so I suspect that both sides will be critical of China over Hong Kong and the COVID issues. And I just therefore think that we have to recognize that it's going to take a while to repair this relationship after the election is over. On energy, I don't think energy prices are coming back anywhere to where they were before they started going down dramatically. But as the economies come back in the world, you will see more need for energy, and we'll see prices inch up, but they're not going to go back to where they were just a few months ago. On the protests, all of us are struck by the problems of social mobility, income inequality. We've had a birth defect when this country started 400 years ago, or when slavery started 400 years ago, and our country's constitution embodied it. We have never really solved this problem, and we're not going to solve it anytime soon. But clearly, there's much more that has to be done. And final comment I'd like to make is this. My own situation, I would say maybe is something that some of you have felt as well. I am 70 years old. When I'm a baby boomer, and when I was in the White House for Jimmy Carter years ago, I was 31 years old when Carter was running for re-election. And I thought, well, he can't possibly lose. He's running against a guy who's 69, about to be 70, Ronald Reagan. How can he get up in the morning at 70? Now that I'm 70, I realize it's really the youth of life and middle age, practically. So I feel much better than I realized I would feel at 70. On the other hand, the COVID-19 crisis has brought home to me my own mortality, and maybe it has to many other people who are baby boomers, because baby boomers are used to the situation where healthcare treatment is available to us if you have reasonable economic means, and you can get treatment so that you can prolong your life for quite some time and live a very, very happy and healthy life well into your 80s or 90s compared to what our parents had. However, the COVID-19 crisis has brought home to me, and I think to many of you, I suspect, that life can be wiped out relatively quickly if you're not careful. Many people I know have died from COVID-19, and they didn't have a chance to say goodbye to their loved ones because of the unusual nature of that. So what it's meant to me is that not only has my family now been struck with it, but I think they're young and they'll get through it, is that you need to do what you want to do with your life and don't postpone things, because you never know how long you're going to be around. And therefore, I urge people to kind of take a fresh look at their bucket list and get things done, because you don't know how fragile life really can be. Just think about, what happened in Minnesota. 9 minutes and somebody's life was gone. And all of us are subject to a very fragile existence if we're not very careful. So I urge all of you to not only be careful with your health, but recognize that if you're my age or younger or somewhere close to it, life is very fragile and can be fleeting. You need to take the best care you can, but try to do what you want with your life and don't postpone it, because you never know how long you have to do the things you really want to do. With that, let me turn it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. And I have a number of serious questions I want to ask you to drill down on it, but I want to start with kind of where you ended, which is, besides being interviewed by me here tonight, what else is on your bucket list? What do you want to make sure you get done?
Well, I signed the Giving Pledge. I was one of the first 40 people to do it, and I resolved to basically give away all my money. I've been fairly fortunate in the business world compared to what I thought I would have when I was starting out in the professional world. So I have a fair bit of money that I committed to giving away, and I'm working on doing it sensibly. But all of us who are parents recognize that our greatest legacy is not the money we give away or maybe the boards we chair or things we do, but it's our children. So if you're fortunate enough to have children, you all recognize that it's the greatest pleasure of life and it can be the greatest difficulty of life. And therefore, if you have children, you want to make sure that they are in good shape before you are not able to do anything further to help them. So I want to make sure my children are well-grounded and well-educated and safely into their professional and personal lives. So that's an important thing for me. And I also want to do what I can finally to give back to the country. I came from very modest circumstances. My parents didn't graduate from college or high school. I grew up in a very small house, and I got lucky to get scholarships. But I want to give back to my country as much as I can while I am alive, because the country made it possible for me to do this. Now, I recognize this country is not perfect, for sure. We have lots of challenges, and I just addressed some of them a moment ago with the protests that we're seeing. They reflect the imperfections of our country, but I want to do what I can to make the country a little bit better place. And I think everybody should take a look at what they're doing with their lives, because all of us have professional lives that have been reasonably successful, or you wouldn't be in this call or in this meeting. But you also should look at what can you do to make this country a slightly better place, because in the end, your legacy is going to be your children and what you might have done to give this country a better opportunity to succeed. And you're going to feel much better about those things than any material possessions you might actually own or buy.
I think that's well said, and I think it speaks so much to the heart of the people who participate in the chamber, so thank you for that. You said a minute ago that you think this recovery takes longer than 2008, and we're getting a number of questions from the audience about kind of why you think that, and if it takes a normal recession, if it takes us 3 years to get over a normal recession, how long do you think this takes before we see pre-COVID numbers?
Well, let me answer it this way, if I can. There is a famous investor named Sir John Templeton, and he said the most dangerous words in the investment world are, "This time is different." So in other words, when you say a recession occurs or there's a great boom, this time is different, we should do different things because it's different, that's a mistake generally. And I think he's generally right. But I would say in this case, this time is different because we've never had before a global pandemic tied up with a global recession. And the reason the recession is different this time is because when the recessions kind of play themselves out, and we have recessions every 7 years on average in the United States since World War II, and they last, 2 to 3 quarters typically, what you have is a financial bust that occurs because there's too much credit out there, people have mispriced assets and so forth. But now you have a fear factor that you don't normally have. The fear factor is going to work, social mingling with people, and that is going to make people change their conduct. And so I don't think people are going to go out and buy what they bought before. People are not going to go out and go to concerts as much as they did, go to movies, go to other events as much as they did. It's going to take a while for people to feel their way back. And I have to be frank as well, many employers now recognize, and all of you who are on this phone call are probably employers, recognize that you can probably get by with fewer employees than you thought you needed. One, because by working remotely, you can see you can do things efficiently. Secondly, the demand for your product, your services, except in certain technology areas or certain other areas that companies have done well, may not be what it once was. And as the world shifts, you have to adjust. And so many of your products or services may not be as desirable as they were before. And therefore, you may not need all these employees to come back. And if your products and services are desirable, yes, you might bring more employees back. Surely, some people are hiring people at record amounts. Amazon has gone from about 500,000 employees to about 850 to 900,000 employees, but that's unique, and not the case everywhere. So I think it's going to take a while for people to feel comfortable going back to work, for employers to feel comfortable hiring as many employees as they had before. And remember, this is a global phenomenon as well. It's not just the US. The Chinese economy has slowed down, the European economy has slowed down, and we haven't even seen the worst effects of COVID-19 in the emerging markets yet. And I think that's going to be a problem as well. So that's the reason.
You know, one of the things that, if you look at the Economic Club or the Chamber, one of the central tenets of what we do is convening. And I think we've gotten good at doing it virtually, but it's not quite the same. And so how do you see the convening part of our businesses changing, and how does the value proposition change for that?
Well, I think people never believed you could do as much as you can do with virtually. It turns out that you can raise money, you can take a company public, you can close a buyout deal, you can do enormous amounts of things in the markets and other kinds of things virtually. And people have gotten used to it, and the technology is actually reasonably good, though it can be better for sure. However, there is a fatigue factor, I suspect. All of you who are on Zoom calls all day probably wonder, as I do, why, if I'm sitting in my office all day on a Zoom call and I'm not traveling around the world, am I more tired than when I was traveling around the world? I think there's a reason for that. And I think just the focus on a computer screen 8 hours a day can tire you out physically. So I think people don't want to just be on Zoom calls all day, and they recognize that in the end, social interaction is what human life is all about. So in the end, human conduct reverts to the mean, and the mean is getting people together. So throughout the organized history of 200, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, whatever you want to say, people have found that life is better when you are convening with other people, your family or your associates or other people you do things with, and that's a more pleasurable thing for life. And I don't think that Zoom can replace those pleasures, but I think people are wary of their own health, and therefore I think they're going to move back relatively slowly into it. I know in my own case, I was invited this afternoon to, my assistant told me I was invited to a ambassador's house for residents. It was only going to be 4 people there, socially distanced at our dinner. And I said, geez, I don't know if I'm really ready for a socially distanced 4-person dinner. So if I'm not ready for a socially distanced 4-person dinner, I have to wonder whether a lot of other people are as well. So I do think it's going to take a while for people to go back to where we were. Eventually they will, but I do think you'll see at some point many companies saying, you can work virtually forever if you want. And I think people are going to do that for quite some time.
It's interesting. I asked you about a specific way of working and an important value proposition on convening. But of course, we have entire industries that are dependent on high density convening for their business model. If you're an airline or a casino, or you mentioned concerts, if we're coming upon summer here, where travel and seasonal businesses are supposed to be seeing their big spikes. I mean, you can imagine that recovery takes even longer, right? So what do you think those high density industries are going to have to do to survive?
Well, the industries that I think have been the hardest hit are, let's say, the cruise industry, the gaming industry, Las Vegas, the hotel industry, and the airline industry, probably been the hardest hit among others. But I guess the concert industry and the performing arts industries have been hard hit as well. And I'll put movies in there. I think it depends on many factors. For example, I live in the Washington, D.C. area. If I go into a store now without a mask, I'm not allowed into the store. And they kick you out. The signs say that. So I'm conditioned to wear a mask. I was in Florida over the weekend at a hotel, and I was the only person with a mask. And people looked at me like, are you crazy? Why are you wearing a mask? You don't need that anymore. So clearly some people in some parts of the country are either tired of this and they are fed up with the quarantining and the mask, and they're going to take some chances. I think it's a risk, because as we learned in the 1918 great influenza, the second wave that came back was more virulent than the first wave. And so you have to be very, very careful. But I do think there's a reason why I use the word quarantine. For those people who don't know where the word came from, it came from the fact that in the 14th and 15th centuries, Venetian ships that would go carrying spices, when they would come back to Venice, they had to stay on the ship for 40 days, quarantine, 40 days, because there were black bubonic plagues in Venice, and they wanted to make sure that the people on the ship were not bringing back plagues into the city. Now, quarantine was really 40 days, and 40 days was kind of the period of time they thought that they could tolerate this. We've been tolerating it for many more months than 40 days, but I think many humans are tired of the quarantine and the masking and so forth. So they just, as a matter of not politics, but they're just ready to get out and to take their chances. But I do think it's going to take a while for airlines to come back. Airlines, I talked today to the head of the Southwest airline, Southwest, and they have some flights are getting booked, but it's not easy. Some airlines have been flying at 3% capacity. Hotels are at 20% occupancy in the United States, more or less, something like that. So it's going to take a while. I'd say 1 year from today, 2 years from today, we'll be close to where we were, but we're not going to be back to where we were, in my view, for a couple years.
One of the questions that I've been asking myself, and I'm really curious your view, given both your personal experience and your professional experience, what do you think this does to the next generation of risk takers, the next generation of people that we want to be entrepreneurs? How does this impact them?
Well, remember, in my parents' generation, they were scarred by the Depression, and they were very leery about spending money. They're always saving, very cautious. I think young people today who live through this will be cautious as well. But I think young people, because they haven't been as adversely affected as older people by COVID-19, I think that they will still be willing to take risks. And I think they will take chances. And I think we will have entrepreneurs because, as you see, as this crisis is unfolding, many people are coming up with ideas for companies that might take advantage in an appropriate way of the needs of people to deal with this. So I don't think entrepreneurship will go away. I do think it will be structured in different means, but I don't think people will lose their willingness to take a risk. And that's one of the great things about our country is the entrepreneurship incentives we've had and the spirit and the mindset of being an entrepreneur. I don't think that will go away.
Good. From your lips to God's ears. We're getting a question here from a member of our board who's saying, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying, if you look at these three crises that we're dealing with, the global pandemic, the economic crisis, and all of the social unrest that you mentioned earlier based on the really deep problems of racial inequality, what do these crises do to impact the roles that CEOs and boards should be playing? So as you speak to this group today of CEOs, what advice do you have for them?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and here's how I look at it. I served for many years as a co-CEO of Carlyle. I'm now the co-executive chairman, but I recognize that the role of the CEO has changed. In the 1920s or 30s or 40s or even the 1950s or maybe even the 1960s, the CEO's job was to run the company, maximize profits in a legal way for shareholders, and not to worry about social responsibilities and not to worry about the kind of social issues that we are all focused on right now. I think a CEO today who is blind to these issues or is tone deaf to them will not be a successful CEO and will not be able to retain the support of his board or her board or their shareholders. So I think today you need to be very sensitive to these issues and spend a fair amount of time on them. So, for example, I think there are probably very few CEOs of major companies today that have not issued or are not going to issue some statement dealing with the protests that we now have going on around the country, because it's a social issue and it clearly affects everybody's business, but also affects your employees and your customers and so forth. So I think you have to comment on it. You have to deal with it. Now, no CEO is going to solve the 400 years problem that we have of racial tensions in this country. No CEO can do that. No one person can do that. No president of the United States can do that. But I do think you have to be much more sensitive to these issues than before. And if you're not, I just don't think you're doing as good a job for your shareholders, your company, because you are expected today to be knowledgeable about these issues and to reflect in some way, some sensitivity to them, even if it's not going to overnight solve the problem.
I think that's an important contribution and something we'll be talking a lot about in the coming weeks and tomorrow at our own board meeting. One of the things I talked about in the introduction and that you talked about in your opening remarks was philanthropy and the importance of giving back. You know as well as anyone about the power of business to do good and to lift lives and communities. And we've seen a lot of examples of that, post this pandemic. I'm just curious what you think businesses could be doing now in terms of best supporting local communities, given what's happened kind of this triple impact, especially for small businesses on Main Street, and what's happened as an impact of these triple crises. What role do we have as business leaders in helping those communities?
Well, of course, we have to remember that business has a limited capacity to do certain things. Government has much more capacity. But for businesses, I think that they should encourage their employees to volunteer. They should encourage their employees to make some donations, and maybe if they can't afford it, to match them in some way. They should encourage their employees to get involved with philanthropic organizations to give back to society and the community in which they operate. They should make it clear that they have a social responsibility. Now, specifically, it's been sad to me and hard to believe that a country as wealthy as ours now has miles and miles of cars lined up with people who've never been unemployed before looking for food because they can't feed their family. And it's sad that we really have this situation, but we do. So I think contributing to food banks or food related things is very helpful. Contributing to healthcare related organizations to make sure these healthcare organizations have the equipment and the employees they need to service people who have these healthcare problems that we've been dealing with. And also in the local community, racial related issues, there's no easy answer to that, but I think a greater sensitivity to hiring people of diverse backgrounds and to using suppliers who have more diversity in their supply system. In other words, employing people who supply your companies, make sure they have some diversity in their workforce as well. And also being much more sensitive to the fact that if you are not going to be involved in helping your local community, helping your employees address these issues, I think you're going to be seen as not as productive a business as it should be. So it's not only a matter of helping other people, and which is a good thing to do, but I think your own business will shrivel a bit from your own employees' unwillingness to kind of be part of an organization, or people not willing to be customers of you if you're seen as antithetical to all the things that are going on in society. Now, in some cases, you might issue a statement and might not do that much. That's not terrific, but it's better to issue a statement and try to do something than to not issue a statement about these things or address them with your employees. So town hall meetings with your employees, communications with your employees, showing some sensitivity to these issues, even if you recognize you can't solve them, is, I think, a much better thing than being silent on them.
Do you think that business has a role in providing guidance to our political leaders at this time as well?
When you get older, your questions, your hearing goes away. So I didn't hear that. No, I heard the question. But look, politics is very complicated in this situation. I do think that business leaders have an obligation to let their elected representatives know their views. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I recognize business is going to be more criticized for that than, let's say, non-business organizations that do lobbying, but that's a fact of life, and we're not going to change that in the near term. I do think that business needs to tell government what it is seeing and what it needs to do, and try to hope that government will listen and be responsive. I recognize that government isn't always going to listen, and in election campaigns, it's very often the case that the business community will not be thought to be by some people in politics as the people you should listen to, because the image of business may not be as good as we'd all like it to be. But I do think that if you're a business, you have an obligation to tell elected officials and administrative officials what you think is appropriate, and do the best you can to try to persuade them, doing all the legal things you can do.
Let me ask you a personal question. You asked me the other day in an interview if I'd learned anything about myself and my work style from working at home. And I confided in you that I had learned I could do a lot of interviews without wearing shoes. And so I both want to know if you're wearing shoes right now, and what have you learned about yourself? Turn the question around. What have you learned about yourself in your work working virtually?
I am wearing shoes. Unfortunately, the same shoes I've been wearing for a week, so I'm going to have to change them now. But I've learned that doing these kind of Zoom calls is a plus and a minus. The plus is you can cover so much ground, you can meet with so many more people, but it is tiring and taxing. And also there is a feeling that you're never off duty. In other words, if you are in normal course, you can say, well, I'm out of town. I can't do this because I have something to do across town or something. Now it's very hard to escape because people recognize you're sitting in your home and, you know, you can adjust people's schedules, and so they can get a hold of you. So I'm not complaining about it. I also recognize, though, that, you know, I enjoy talking to people, and I enjoy learning about things from people. And one of the pluses of this is that I'm getting a chance to talk to people more than I would otherwise, because I don't have to travel. I usually travel 225 days a year. I'm now wondering whether I needed to travel that much, because I could have done all this on Zoom. But
well, I think you've given us so much to think about. It's always so intriguing to talk to you. It makes my head spin. And we're starting tomorrow morning's Board of Directors meeting with breakout sessions so that the directors can give us some advice on the challenges and opportunities ahead. And you've given us so much food for that conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here tonight.
I want to thank you again, Suzanne and Tom, for inviting me. I've enjoyed my relationship with the Chamber. I look forward to doing it for many, many more years. Please let me know if I can ever be of help.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you found that valuable. Please join us again next week. And if you've missed any of the previous programs, all of our episodes are posted on uschamberfoundation.org, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. I look forward to talking with you again soon.